Garden bed is basically ready to go. Hello and welcome to my workshop. My name is Ismail. I'm the owner of Thrive and Grow Gardens, and we're here today about to build some redwood raised garden beds. And I want to show you some of the things that we do to really make these projects a great success. And we end up with a really nice product at the end, and there's a lot of little things that lead up to that. So we're going to go through today choosing lumber, making cuts. I'll show you some of the tools that we're using, and we'll get right into assembly as well. So let's get started. Okay, so you can see that we have already done our lumber run. And so we've gone through and we've chosen some really nice choice pieces that we're going to use for these raised garden beds. And that part of the process is important to me. By taking a little bit of time and making sure you choose some really nice straight pieces and boards that don't have a lot of big cracks in them, things like that, then you really end up with a nicer product at the end. So you're going to want to start with a cut list, and this is just your process of going through and saying, okay, here's exactly what I'm going to need before I get started cutting. And with that process of going and getting what you need for your project, you need to determine a couple of things first. First, what size garden bed are you making? We're building 4x8 garden beds with benches for this project. So we have our lumber here in the shop, we have our cut lists, and now we're going to go through and just do some general sorting, essentially figuring out which of these boards are going to be our longer, close to 8-foot boards, and which are going to be the shorter 4-foot boards. So some of this wood is straighter than others, and I'm going to use my straightest pieces for those longest boards. And if I have some that have just a little bit of a curve to them, I can cut those in half and use them as the 4-footers. So Aurora and I are going to go through and sort everything out and get ready to start making some cuts. Okay, so we have a couple of these 4x4 posts, and we're going to go ahead and just put those off to the side. This is what we use, and let's put them all the way down. This is what we use for our corner posts in the garden bed. So we're building two 4-foot by 8-foot garden beds today. So we're sorting our boards into piles of 4-footers and piles of 8-footers. And I'm going to choose those straightest boards for the 8-footers. Just like I was talking about when we selected our boards when we were at Lowe's, we just are looking down and we can see that the board has a little bit of a curve in it. And this one does, it's a little bit curved, so it'll be our 4-footers. It's easier to deal with a curve over a short distance cutting that down than it is over a full long 8-foot side of the bed. All right, so this is a 4-footer, and we're gonna need 16 8-footers and 8 boards for 4-footers. So this will be an 8. Some of these boards will have some marks on them and things like that, but this is an 8, but we sand the whole bed down when we're done too, so it'll really bring out the natural beauty in the wood during that phase. This is a 4. This one is a little extra crowned. Sometimes they really bend after you bring them home. 4-footer, and so I like to put that with the crown, with that hump upward, so that the weight of the other boards will push down on them and it kind of helps straighten them out. 4-footer. Footers here as well, but those are going to be for our benches. All right, so we're about to get to cutting, and let me first introduce you to my assistant, Aurora DeShazo. She's Thrive and Grow Gardens' master builder. She does a lot of the construction of the garden beds that we build, including a lot of metal work too. Aurora's awesome. So what she's gonna be doing right now is making some templates for us. Instead of having to go through for each of these cuts and measuring with a measuring tape every single one and marking it, we just measure and make one cut for each size board that we need, and then she can just go through and use that to mark all the other boards, and it just goes a lot faster. If you have the luxury of having somebody working on these projects for you, it's really great. I mean, I think this is best as a two-person job, and we really have a great time working together and just flowing through these projects, and so it can be really fun. So starting with our 4x4 posts, and those are 21 3/4 inches is the size that we make those. If you add up in your head, okay, I'm using 4 2x6 boards for the side of this garden bed. 2x6 boards are supposed to be about 5.5 inches wide. However, they don't end up being exactly that. And what we found is that if you make your posts 21 3/4 inches, it really helps to make up for some of the variance that you're gonna run into. And then you won't have the posts sticking out past the sides of the bed. So 21 3/4 seems to cover all of the potential variance that we run into with this kind of wood. Let me show you some of the tools. Of course, I've got my eye protection and ear protection. That's very important. That's ready to go. This is my cutting station. I use a compound miter saw, and this one has really treated me well over the years. I've been using it for almost 8 years, something like that. This is a rigid, and it has all the features that I need it to have. And I really like being able to hook it directly up to my shop vac here. You can see the hose going back, and that just makes it a lot cleaner in the shop so you're not blowing dust everywhere. Aurora and I built this table setup that just makes it really easy to have a good flat surface that's in line with the saw. You can also use tools like this. These roller stands are another way to hold your boards on either side of your workstation. But this works really well for us having a table set up like this. So I'm gonna make Aurora that first template, and then she can get to marking the rest, and we just get to where we're flowing through and she's marking boards and I'm cutting them. Okay, so now that we have a template for these cuts, it's really easy to just set it up and mark those next boards. Now, you do want to make sure that you're not just going through and you're marking each one. You see how she's moving over to the other side? The blade takes out about 1/16 of an inch, and if you don't account for that, then they won't end up being the right length for you. So she's going to mark this side and then that side, and I'll go through and I'll cut those off. And then she'll mark the next one that she can get out of this particular board. All right, so we're gonna cut our 8-foot boards now, and those are gonna be cut at 93 inches because our total length of this bed is 8 feet. But we have to account for the ends, and that totals 3 inches. So 93 inches for these long boards will give us a total length of 8 feet. In this particular case, that's what we're building for this client, but you may want to just keep that full 8-foot board. And then the total length of the bed would be 8'3". You don't have to trim off that 3 inches, but that's what we're doing in this particular case. Now keep in mind, these boards, they're not gonna be exactly 8 foot. So even if you're gonna keep them as 8-footers, still measure them, and in most cases, you'll end up trimming a little bit off because some of them may be even a 1/2 inch over, and some of them might be a 1/4 inch over, and some of them might be exactly 8 foot, and you put all those together and it can really be a mess when you're done because you have all these different lengths. Since we're cutting off 3 inches off these boards, it's an opportunity to trim off any parts that might be problematic later on. It's like this board here has a pretty good split in it. You can see that it goes all the way through. And so, you know, it's not the worst thing, but if I am gonna choose any end to trim off, I'd rather choose the end that is a little bit split. And that'll help to ensure that the board won't split further once it's actually installed in the garden. So just something to watch out for as you go through and make all of your cuts. So we're cutting our 4-foot boards now, and you can see Aurora has her template. So she made her first mark, and then again, remember this little tip. You want to go over to the other end and set up that template and mark from there, because we want to make sure we're always accounting for the blade width. And you can see that there is 2 lines now because the board is not exactly 8 foot long. It's like 8 foot and a quarter. So we're gonna end up with this little bit that we're trimming out, and that'll make it really precise. If you were to assume that they were actually 8 foot long and just go through and cut them in half, then you would end up with some really oddly differing sizes. Okay, our boards are cut and we're ready to start building. We're gonna start by building the ends of the garden beds. If you pre-build the ends, then the rest screws together really quite easily. I'm gonna show you a few different little tips that is gonna help you with this process. You know, just like any project around the house, you know how it's just those little things. It's the preparation, the little things that you do that really leads to a good end result. And the things that I care about is I want everything to line up as well as I can. I don't want gaps between the boards. I want everything to be pretty straight and square. And that really gives that kind of like awe factor once the garden bed is done. Many of our clients, when we're finished with one of these garden beds and get it into their landscape, they think of it like this, like a piece of art and like a piece of fine furniture really in their landscape. And it's because of all these little tricks. So I want to teach you a concept called crowning. And this is for this process of sorting through the boards. Instead of just screwing all these things together, we actually plan which sides of these boards we want to see. Some of the boards might have some defects on one side or the other, so we're going through and we're looking at which side is prettier, and then also using this crowning concept. The same type of thing I was showing you when you're choosing the wood, looking down the board and seeing if there's one side or the other that has a little bit of a bow upwards or downwards. This particular board is actually extremely straight, but I can see that this side is a little bit more convex and this side is a little bit more concave. I'm gonna pay attention to that. Now, this is my pretty side. This I would consider the top because it's slightly bowed upwards. And if I keep that upwards bow in the same direction on all these boards, then they fit together kind of like a puzzle piece. Whereas if you have them in opposite directions, then you can see how it would create a little bit of a space between the boards. And some soil can come out between those spaces and it just won't look quite as sharp. So I'm gonna go ahead and start laying out the boards for each of these ends. And we do the same thing for the sides too. It takes a few minutes, but it really leads to a pretty garden bed at the end. Sometimes it's hard to choose which side you want to use because they can both be really pretty, and some of the boards are very straight. And these are both very straight boards. These were all pretty straight boards, but you can see they fit really nicely together. You don't have any big gaps. And I like the patterns here. I'm actually paying attention to that. Sometimes on these redwood boards, you'll get some that are just very dark red, and sometimes they have these different little stripes here. And so I'm just kind of thinking about how it's gonna look in the end. And this is gonna make a really good end, so this one's done, and we'll do the same thing going through the rest of this wood and getting it all ready to screw them together. We're getting ready to build the ends of these garden beds, and we like to do it up on a table, just as a nice working surface. You don't have to bend over. We actually have our table already pre-marked, so I know exactly where to put these things. But let me show you what we're doing here. So first of all, I want to think about what the top part of the post is going to be. So I'm building this upper area as the top of the board. So this is going to be the top. And so just one thing to consider is that on some of these, this factory end here, it's really rough. And I don't really want that rough side upwards because then we'll just put some work into sanding it. So instead, I'm going to just turn it over and put the cut side up. And then that'll be less work during the sanding phase. So these are 48-inch wide ends, and these posts would then need to be 45 inches from outside to outside. And that's gonna give us that 1.5-inch overhang on each side. So you can imagine once this is upright with that 1.5-inch overhang, the side boards will just fit right into that. And that's kind of how the whole thing locks together. So just to give you a quick measure and make sure that it's right, I've got my lines, but I like to do just a little bit of fine tuning. We're dealing with wood, so it's not all gonna be perfect. It won't always be super straight, and if you need to make any little tweaks, it's okay to do that at this point. So I've got my 45 inches here, and 45 inches here, and I'll check back in on that before we actually screw everything together. If you pay attention during this phase, then it'll all be nice and square and straight, and that makes the whole bed screw together really nicely. One of the things that I really like to use are guides. Things like this can make this process so easy. Instead of coming in here and having to measure, okay, did I get it in at 1.5 inches on each side? I can just use these little boards that I've cut that can slip right underneath the ends here. And then I can just use a feel to know that I have it all lined up. So I'm lining it up with the top, making it flush with the top, and then I'm also making it flush with these sides. And so once I've got the top one set, then I can come down and get the side ones as well, the lower boards I mean. And then same thing, I just slide this down and keep on coming all the way down and making sure that the whole thing is lined up just right. It feels good. I think that we've got it. Once I've done these little adjustments, I like to just go ahead and measure it one more time. 45 inches, 45 inches. So by taking those little steps, we could really ensure that those posts are gonna be nice and parallel to each other. And you'll really see the end result. If you aren't careful with that and they sort of bow inwards, then the bed might be a little bit crooked when it's all done, or certain parts of it might not go together very well during the rest of the assembly phase. So these little steps just really make it a lot easier. For my garden beds, I just really like uniformity. It satisfies me, and I like things to be symmetrical and really line up super well. And the easiest way to do that is by creating guides, just like we've been doing with these little sideboard guides for lining up these ends and for the templates for making our cuts. It's all the same sort of concept. So in this case, what I have is just a very simple, just a little scrap piece of wood that is cut to the perfect size to be able to line up where my screws are gonna go. And you can see here I have some marks, and this is to make sure that the screws will be very uniform in each of the boards. Anytime I've ever thought, oh, I can eyeball this, I mean, it's just impossible to be really super precise and also quick with your work. So this helps. This helps tremendously with that. So all I have to do is set this here and then put my screw right on that line, and that's going to ensure that they all line up really nicely all the way down the side, and that they go into this support post that is what really is the structural support for this whole garden bed. So we're gonna start drilling now, and this is the drill that I like to use. I've had this thing for years and I have beat the heck out of it. These Makita drills are really great. The batteries last a long time, and they stay pretty powerful all the way through the battery, like almost dying. So they're really good. This is actually a hammer drill, and I find that that's fantastic for getting these in with a little bit more ease, that little impact action that it has really sets these screws well. We're using ceramic coated decking screws, and these are actually self-drilling screws, so they go in really easily. So even though this is a self-tapping screw, you don't have to pre-drill it. There's some little tips that I can give you here, and I want to give you a little demonstration on how you can pre-drill and even countersink your holes to make room for the head without having to use a separate countersink drill bit. And this is just a technique that I developed over time that just removes that extra step. And what it really helps with this kind of project is making sure that you don't split the ends. I really hate it whenever I get into there and it just splits right open. And so even though these are self-drilling, once the head gets down in and starts pushing into the board, it can actually force it to split right here. So this technique of countersinking and pre-drilling will help to eliminate that split. So what we're gonna start doing is begin drilling it in, and we're only gonna go part way, just basically in through the threads. And then I'm gonna put it in reverse and back it out. And while it's in reverse, I'm actually gonna use the screw to open up this and give it a little countersink that will make room for the head of the screw. See that, how there's space in there now? So whenever I drill this in all the way, right into that space that I made. And since the head isn't pushing out to make room for itself, it doesn't split the end. All right, so now this is kind of the fun part. Aurora and I love just kind of like flowing together, and this is where the teamwork aspect of these projects can be really fun. She's going along and kind of pre-marking where these screws are going, handing me screws, helping hold things when necessary. And we like to go through and just do one screw per board. That can actually be really helpful. If somehow you've made a mistake, then you can correct it, move the board as needed, and drill into where the other spot is going to be. Once we've screwed in the top board, we should have 45 inches to here, and that's good. Now we want to also make sure that this process hasn't moved the posts on the bottom. So I'm going to measure this side as well and make sure that it's still 45 inches, and it is. So it's just good to double check that, because this process of screwing this in, those posts can get moved out just a little bit, and this is a good point in which you can check that and make sure everything still lines up really well, and just, you know, doing a little double checking can really go a long ways. Like this really felt like it needed to get moved over just a little bit, and so this is my opportunity to do that. So we're gonna finish off this end and move through and build the other 3 ends, and then we can get to assembling the rest of the garden bed. The depth that I'm screwing these in here, I want to make sure that the head of this screw is below the surface of this board. That way when we sand it, we don't take the ceramic coating off. We want to really keep it out of the way. Otherwise, it'll actually rust. So that's what we're trying to avoid by using the ceramic coated screws to begin with. We have a completed end. So this gives us the space that we need for those other boards to come right up into here, and Everything is looking really nice and straight. I love how these are nicely in line with the tops, and it looks really good. Especially once we get this sanded and stained, it's gonna be beautiful. Okay, while Aurora is sorting the rest of those boards, getting ready for the assembly of our raised garden beds, I'm coming back to our cut list because we still have a few more things to cut. We need the braces, and what we do are some long braces that span the width of the bed, 2 of them, and those will help to make sure that we keep the bed from bowing out from the weight of the soil. And then also we have some vertical boards that we like to put in, and that's actually what the other horizontals will attach to. And so I'm gonna cut all those right now. Now our garden bed is 48 inches wide from the outside to the outside, which means the inside is 45 inches. So 1.5 inches for each of those boards. We have to make sure we subtract that off. So I just need to cut 4 pieces for these 2 garden beds, each at 45 inches. And then I'm gonna cut my vertical braces, and you'll see how those really help hold the garden bed together and give us something to attach the horizontals to. I'm gonna cut those. Those could be just anywhere around like 20 inches. They don't have to be all the way to the bottom of the garden bed, but 20, 21 inches is fine. If you have some scraps lying around that are about that size, you can certainly use those. I've got some boards here that are the more kind of messed up, crooked boards. You could even ask for those half off at the lumber yard and then specifically use them for braces, and that's usually what we'll do. We'll pick a few that are kind of messed up that'll be fine for bracing, but not straight enough and pretty enough for the garden beds themselves. And so we're just gonna use those to cut our braces, and they'll be ready to shore everything up once the bed's together. Okay, so I've got my 45-inch braces already cut, and now I need those verticals. And like I said, those can be cut at about 20 inches. We just want them to be long enough to cover at least a lot of the bottom board, but we don't want it to protrude above the top. So for that process, there are 2 different ways that I go about doing it, depending on whether I'm building a bed with a bench or not. If I'm building it with a bench, then I want the top of that brace to be flat. That way when I set the bench on there, it gives it additional support. It'll have the edge of the garden bed, plus it'll have this support. If I'm doing it without a bench, then it's really good to do these as a 45-degree miter cut right here. And so if you cut that at a 45-degree angle, it's just a really nice look when it's all done. The soil will come up to, somewhere in here, and then this part of it will just taper off into the edge of the garden bed. And I think it looks really good. It's just a nice little touch. So we are doing benches on this garden bed. We'll go ahead and just cut them straight. All right, our braces are cut, and so I'm gonna get them ready to screw on once the garden bed is put together. And basically, I'm just going to line it up here. This is the top of the garden bed, and I'm gonna draw some lines on my little template board, just roughly to show me where the boards are on these. And you can see I made this a little bit short. They could be a little bit longer, but this is gonna be fine for bracing this bottom board. So now I can go through and I can pre-drill in some of these screws. I like to sort of stagger them like this. And we're gonna use a different screw for this process. We were using 3-inch screws to go into here, but if we use those on this, well, the board width equals 3 inches, and by the time it sinks in a bit, it can actually pop through the other side of the bed. So we're gonna use 2.5-inch screws for these braces. 2.5-inch screws. This is what we're gonna use for the braces. I'm just gonna get these started. And that'll make it much easier when we get to actually putting them on. I like to spend as little time down on the ground, putting pressure on my knees as I can, so some of this preparation is really helpful. So I'm doing a little staggering here, and that'll really help to keep the boards together and keep them from splitting. If I lined these screws up, then they'd be penetrating in the same line. It's more likely to split the board that way. All right, well, 7 more to go. Now I have this one that I can use to line up all the rest of these. I don't have to mark them all. I can just sort of see where they go. This is all going to be buried on the inside of the bed. We're gonna get these pre-drilled as well. I'm going back to the 3-inch screws since these can't possibly come through the side of the bed. They're gonna get screwed right into the braces. And I like to have them prepared as well. So on these ones, you just wanna come in maybe 3/4 of an inch from the edge. And 3/4 of an inch should be enough that you'll be able to actually screw into the side of that board. So, you know, anywhere right in there, or maybe even a little bit less is good. To put these beds together, we have everything all laid out, and the ends are built, the braces are all done, and we're gonna start putting it all together. This is definitely something that is nice to have 2 people on, but we're also gonna use some clamps. I can show you some ways you can use clamps to do the assembly by yourself. We have our work area pretty well set up here, our pre-built ends, and then the boards that have already been sorted, these are actually set up in a particular way. This is what we determined was going to be the top. Remember, we crowned all of our boards to make sure they fit together really nicely. And so this is set up to where when we lift it up, we just put it right into place, each board right into place. And then this other stack is set up the same way. It'll just lift it right up into place with these being the tops. So now it's just a matter of getting everything just sort of roughly lined up, and we'll start putting those first boards into place, and we'll clamp them on to make sure that it's easy to screw them on without having too much difficulty holding them. And we're all set up. We're getting ready to put those first boards into place. So we have our clamps ready. It's gonna really make things a lot easier, especially if you're doing this by yourself. I don't know how you would do it without clamps. And so we wanna make sure that things are pretty square. Let's take these top 2 boards and put them off to the side. So we're gonna take the bottom board and put it into place. That'll help us to ensure that the distance between the bottom on each side is the same as it is on the top. Then we can put the next board into place, and this one will clamp. So I'm looking to get this pretty well flush, lined up with the board on the end. And then I also want to set up my clamp where it's not in the way of the screws. I'm going to be putting the screws about right here. So this is pretty good. I'm going to be looking for a couple other things here too. Looking at how the bottom of this board lines up with the bottom of the next. So I could actually sacrifice this flushness a little bit for making sure that this bottom edge lines up well. And it varies because the wood isn't always the same. So you kind of have to assess this and see how you think it's gonna go. And
I think I am gonna aim to line up the bottom of this board with the bottom of this one. So I'm actually gonna adjust that a little bit, and Aurora will do the same thing on her side. Just bring it down a little bit. Because I especially, I do have a bench that's gonna go on top of here and it's gonna cover all this up. So if this isn't perfect, it doesn't bother me too much. And I'd really like to make sure I don't have any big gaps between any of the boards. I think that matters more than anything. So this looks good right here. Okay. We'll get the other side set up before we start drilling. Putting in our bottom. Make sure everything is nice and square. So there's a couple little things you could do at this point just to double check before you start screwing. One really cool thing about this method is pre-building the ends and doing them as precisely as we did. When you screw everything together, it tends to just pull it all into really, really square. So I do have a framing square on hand, and we can put that on the corners just to verify that things are looking pretty good. And you can see here, it's all lining up just perfectly on this edge and on this edge. So we've got a nice square corner. And so I always have this on hand. I like to just sort of check my work, but I'll tell you what, we've never really had any problems with this method with them not being square. And it looks great. So now if your concrete is level, then you can also check the tops here and see, how level all of this is, and it's looking pretty darn close. We've got our handy guides for setting our screws, just like we used on the ends. I'm going to use the exact same process for this so that they are all in line with each other in the way that I like. So just a matter of setting it here, getting the screw started, just pressing it into place. And I'm going to use those exact same techniques. Remember, sink those in a little deeper so we don't sand off those screw heads, the ceramic coating off of there. And it's all going really great. We haven't had any boards split yet because we're doing that little bit of extra work to countersink those holes as we put them in. So I always like to only do one screw per board at a time because it gives us some flexibility that if something goes wrong, we have the ability to make a little bit of adjustment. If you put both screws into place, then it's really hard to make any adjustments later. Basically, the screws will want to keep going into those same holes that were already there. So if something's messed up and I need to take this one out, then I would actually use this spot to screw it into place. And that would be creating an opportunity for it to go in without it going into the same hole as what was already there. So we'll go around and we'll just put one screw into each of these, and once we're really happy with how it's all assembled, then go around and put the rest of the screws into place. All right, so the bed is all together. I'm loving the way that it looks. Everything looks just nice and square. I don't have any strange gaps. Again, we're dealing with wood, so there's going to be some little variances, and you just have to sort of work with it, and that's what one of the elements of woodworking. Each project is just a little bit different. But this is looking really great. So now we'll go back around and we'll put in the rest of the screws around the edges, and we'll move on to putting in the braces. All right, Aurora's already gone around and put these in place for me. Makes it super fast and easy. Looks good. All right, we're gonna put these braces on now, and this is gonna help us to do a couple different things. For one thing, you can actually see right here what can happen. You see this little lip right here? when we put those braces on the inside, we'll be able to actually pull this in to where all of these boards are really nice and flush with one another. And that's also going to keep things very firm in place for when there's actually soil in here pushing out on these boards. So that's the first benefit of using these vertical braces. And then we'll attach to the vertical braces our long horizontal braces. And that prevents heaving, prevents the boards from pushing out from the weight of the soil. So by doing this type of thing, we've seen garden beds stand up for many years just exactly the same shape as when we put them into place. And that's what I want to see here. Really getting the most out of our investment and the most enjoyment out of it as well. Just seeing something really beautiful that we can be proud of in the landscape. We just need to come in 32 inches to the center of each of these braces. Now, if you had decided that you were going to use a bench, then you might have done the same thing that we're doing here of putting the nice, flat side here to help support the bench. And we're just going to line up the center of this brace at 32 inches. It can be helpful to have an extra person to help push on these boards, and Aurora's going to help me with that here, and just make sure as we're screwing them together that they suck up real nicely to this brace. Thank you. It's good to have a level handy and make sure that you get these braces really vertical, especially when you're up close to them. It can be hard to tell whether they're actually perfectly vertical. And then I use my knee to hold the bottom into place. And again, we use 2.5-inch screws here to make sure we don't go all the way through the other side. This is the part where tears happen if you accidentally used a 3-inch long screw. Sometimes, if it doesn't feel like it really pulled up tightly to that board, sometimes you have to go out and then back in again. And then here's another opportunity to make sure that it's nice and vertical with your level before you start putting more screws into place. So I'm going to just hold this really tightly and put this next screw in, and then once I start going onto each next board, Aurora is going to push on the outside and make sure that these boards get really tight up to this brace, and then you'll see on the other side it'll be nice and smooth and flush when we're done. I can see it's really nice and tight through here. That looks really good, especially over on this side, it's tight. Looks great. And I can see right here, this bottom one is bulging out. So Aurora pushing on the bottom, see it kind of popped it into place. That really makes a big difference. So she's gonna hold it there and we'll get it screwed in. That one started to split this board and I don't really feel like it pulled on it hard enough. So I'm gonna pull it back and put the other one in first. That gives me another opportunity to pull that board in really tight. I'll go ahead and countersink it a little bit to help. All right. Good, that's what we're looking for. Looks really good on that side now. And then we just go around and do the same thing, putting all these braces into place. This is what I was talking about. With a good quality drill, it stays pretty powerful all the way till the battery is just completely dead. And I really like that. I've used cheaper drills in the past and they really taper off continuously, and these are a lot more reliable through the life of the battery. So that's really nice, and of course it's good to have a charged battery ready to go. Okay, so the braces are in on this side, and now this is really nice and flush. It looks good. The boards are well lined up with one another, and that's what I'm looking for. So this is really firm and solid and strong, and we'll move over to the other side and then put our horizontal braces in. Now that we have the vertical pieces into place, we can put in the horizontals, and they really help to make the whole garden bed really nice and square. Because if you actually measure this, you'll see that sometimes these edges sort of bow out. Now, the end of our garden bed is 48 inches, and I want the center of the garden bed to be that too. It's actually about 48 inches and a quarter, 48 and a quarter inches. So we can, while we're putting this into place, we can push those sides in and get them to where they're really nice and square instead of having the middle of the garden bed bow out. So it can be very helpful to have a helper when you're doing that. So I'm gonna get this one into place, and I'm actually gonna just put this a little bit lower in the garden bed. I don't like it to be in the way when we're digging into the garden bed, so I put it in the bottom third of the garden bed, and I can get it tight to one side, and then Aurora can just push that side to me whenever I screw that into place. Okay, so now that that side's in and Aurora pushes to me, you'll see that gap will disappear. Might need, okay, we're gonna have to do some creative garden bed yoga here. Gotta hold on this side. Okay, go ahead, Aurora.
You want me to screw it in?
I think I can get it. All right. And this one was a little bit too far in, so I'm gonna move it. All right. What do we have? 48 inches. So it's gonna look really good looking down the edge of the bed. And not everybody will notice those differences, but I do, so it matters to me. All right, so it's time to do one other really important touch, and that is putting a rodent barrier at the bottom of the garden bed. So when you're pre-building them like this in the shop, it's really easy to just tilt the bed up onto its side and attach the hardware cloth directly onto the bed. We use a 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and that'll even keep the smallest mice out. So here in Tucson, we have an issue with ground squirrels, and if they get up under the garden bed, they can really cause a lot of problems. So we want to prevent that right now. So we'll go ahead and tilt this up. And the tools we're gonna wanna use for this are a grinder. I'm using the same grinder I got out of that Makita kit that I got. So this is a battery powered one, which is really nice. We also have a corded one too, but I like this for this type of thing. Our other tool is a DeWalt stapler. So this is really effective at just putting these construction staples. These are T50 staples, and we'll use that to get those into the bottom of the garden bed. Good. Yeah, staplers are great for this. A lot faster than having to use screws. So now that that's done, we just have to trim off the extra that we have here. And I'll trim this top edge a little bit too, so that you can't see it from the outside of the garden bed. So just get a nice little line right here. This stuff is pretty easy to cut. Rodents aren't getting into this garden bed. Not from the bottom. All right, we did it. Garden bed is basically ready to go, and we're gonna do a couple more things to this, and we'll show you on a future video how to put a bench on the edge, and that'll make this a little bit more comfortable to sit on, and it looks really nice too. So we're gonna use redwood 2x6 to do a bench on the next video, and also we'll be sanding and staining this garden bed, and another video coming your way for that as well. But up to this point, I hope you've learned a lot, some of the little woodworking tips and tricks that you can apply to this type of project or to maybe some other around your home. Thanks for watching, and happy gardening. Hello and welcome to the Thrive and Grow Gardens workshop. My name is Michael, and today we're going to be putting some benches onto some raised garden beds that we built. If you didn't catch that video, check it out. We went through the whole process of building a raised garden bed out of redwood. So now we're gonna put a bench on it. And this is something that a little added touch that I really love on raised garden beds. It looks really fantastic and it's really comfortable to sit on too. So we're gonna go through today, and one of the really cool things I'm gonna teach you is how to get a perfect 45-degree mitered corner on really what is an imperfect object. We're dealing with wood here, so it can't be just perfectly square. So I'm gonna show you how to get really nice, tight corners. We're gonna be using basically the same kind of tools that we use when we put the garden bed together. We've got our Makita impact drill and the ceramic coated deck screws. We'll be using 3-inch deck screws, ear protection, eye protection, tape measure, and of course a pencil. And then for making our cuts, we'll use the same saw that we use to build the garden bed. I'm using my rigid compound miter saw, and this has been my trusty saw for quite a few years now, and has all the nice little adjustments that we need to make it easy to get those 45-degree corners. We're gonna start with our measurements and we'll get right to cutting. The dimensions for these beds are 4 foot by 8 foot. So we've got 8 foot to the outside edge of the garden bed, and I want these benches to hang over a bit. It's gonna give the bench a little bit more stability. It'll take up less of the inside of the bed, and it looks really nice hanging over. They're gonna hang over by 1.5 inches. So what does our total length of the bench need to be? The total length of our long boards on this 8 foot long bed is going to need to be 8'3". So that accounts for the 1.5 inch hangover on each side. So these first cuts are really easy. We just do 8'3" long boards, and we'll do those cuts at a 45-degree angle. And the next step is where I'll show you how to get those corners really tight together, even though this bed might not be perfectly square. So the longest lumber that we used when we built the redwood garden bed were 8-footers, and those are a lot easier to get straight ones at the lumber yard. But it's good to always select some longer that makes it really easy for the long side of these benches. So we have a couple of 10-foot boards that we're going to use, and they are really, we chose some really nice ones. This is a gorgeous piece of redwood here. So one thing that we want to look at before we start making our cuts is that the ends of these sometimes have splits on them. You can see this one has a split here. So, if this were longer, I may actually want to start my first cut further back, but I want to cut this off because this is a spot that would be prone to cracking, and I'd really like to avoid that. So now we need to make some adjustments to our saw. We're gonna be doing all 45-degree angle cuts on this. And so you're gonna need to have a saw that can do that. This one has some pretty simple adjustments. There's a part here that locks it into place, and then this one helps set it into these varying different notches. So I just need to move this over to 45 degrees and lock it into place. And now I can get a really good, crisp, accurate 45-degree cut. Got my board ready. I know I want to cut some of this off. This is a 10-foot board and I only need 8'3" of it, so I can cut a little bit off of each end and that's totally fine. My ear protection and eye protection, safety first. All right, so now that I have that first 45-degree cut, I could readjust the saw to cut the other side, but it's actually a lot easier to just flip the board over. So I'm gonna do that now. Flip this over. And that way, the 45-degree angle on this side is facing the opposite direction. All I have to do is measure from this furthest edge. And I'm going for 8'3", all the way out to the edge. 8'3". Measure twice, cut once. You know in that last video how I was showing you that you can cut a board and then if you need other boards to be just like it, you can use it as a template? We're gonna do exactly the same thing here, at least for these longest boards. Before I use it for a template, I just wanna make sure it's actually gonna work well on the garden bed. So here's what we're shooting for here. We want an 1.5" overhang, and of course a piece of 2x6 wood gives us that 1.5". We can line up the outside of our little guide here with the outside of the bench. Make sure that this 45-degree angle cut is just perfectly in line with the corner, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. That looks really good. That looks really good, and it lines up really nicely on each side. So I'm very happy with using this as a template to make our next piece. Here's our next piece that we're gonna cut. And I'm always looking at it to determine, begin with the end in mind. How is this gonna end up facing? I know that I like this side. It's much prettier than this. Look at that. What a different piece of wood from this angle, but this is really nice. I have this one knot right here, and I think I would prefer that to be on the inside of the garden bed. So I'm gonna think about this in the way that I lay this template on here. So basically I just need to flip this around if I want it to be on the inside. It's nice having tall ceilings. All right, no major splits on the ends to worry about. I'm gonna come in a little bit from the end because there's a slight split, or at least the potential for a split right here. And just have to make sure that it's lined up nicely. I do prefer to use a pencil with a really fine tip. The mechanical pencils, the lead does break pretty easily, but this is a great way to be precise. So I'm just gonna get this right in here and get my mark. Our first cut is done, And now we're gonna want to flip this board over to mark it. So just go ahead and flip it over. It enables us to mark it on the appropriate side based on the way that the saw is set up. That way we don't have to readjust the angle of the saw. So I just need to line these up, get them nice and flush with one another. That feels good. All right. Let me show you a little trick here. I want to show you how to make a cut along this without it splintering. And the key here is actually just to go part way through with one pass and then go through the rest of the way. Get it all nice and lined up. That looks good.
That was great. So now we have our two long boards and we'll get them set on the bed. And our goal here is to get these screwed into place before we mark the short end boards. And that's where I'll show you that little trick is to get it to where those boards, those 45-degree angles, get really nice and tight together. It'll really impress anybody that comes along and takes a look at your woodworking. Okay, so now this part's easier if you have two people. Aurora's gonna help me and we're gonna get these all set up nicely on the garden bed. Remember to use your 1.5" guide for that 1.5" overhang. Or if you want your overhang to be a little bit different, then you can make it a different width. We're gonna tack these benches on. By tack it on, I mean we're just gonna add in 2 screws, one on each end. And that's where it is really helpful to have a second person. Aurora's gonna hold down on one side while I screw in the other side. Now, you're gonna wanna make a guide for this, is my recommendation. Instead of going along with a tape measure for each part, you can make yourself a little piece of wood that you can use to mark where the screw's gonna need to go. Now, the boards that we're screwing into are 1.5" wide, and we want that screw to go right in the middle of them. So, also we have an 1.5" overhang. So if we want that 1.5" overhang plus 3/4 of an inch, that's gonna get us to where our screw is gonna go right directly into this. So this is your best way to be really precise without having to keep getting out your tape measure. So I like to double check before I start screwing everything in that I'm happy with the placement of all of this. I feel like this one could just get moved a little bit. Yeah, that looks really good. Okay, so now Aurora will push directly down on this side and that'll keep it from moving around, which is really easy to do with a long board like this. I have my own methods for how I like to screw these in, and I'm looking for basically uniformity. I want things to be pretty symmetrical. This is the part that you're definitely going to see. I like to line my guide up here with this part, and that'll be my first screw right here. So if I just line up my guide with the edge and put the screw right here, it's gonna go directly into the middle of the board that's underneath. Now remember, I taught you some techniques when we were building these garden beds for getting these screws in without splitting. Anytime you're drilling in next to an edge like this, it's very prone to splitting, and it'll create a little disappointment if you split this here. So we want to do everything we can to avoid it. Remember our technique for countersinking and pre-drilling these?
here it is. I'm gonna show you again. Going part way in, and then backing it out, and then keeping it in reverse. We create a nice countersunk divot here for the screw to set into. That way the head of the screw doesn't push open the wood and split it here. Make sure to get that screw head below the surface so that when we sand it, we don't take off that ceramic coat, which will make the screw rust. Now just one more tack on the other side. Great, no splits, that makes me happy. We're getting to that point where I can show you this really cool trick. Here's what happens. You build this beautiful wood bed, and it all actually seems pretty precise. You even put a framing square on it, and everything lines up pretty well. But when you cut these 45-degree cuts on these first boards and you screw it on, if you were just to take your end piece and measure it and then just cut a standard 45-degree, it's a little unpredictable how big that gap is going to be. It might not be just quite right. Also, maybe you'll cut it just a little bit too long with your measurements or a little bit too short and it won't quite fit at first, or it'll be a little bit too big of a gap. We can avoid all of that by just cutting our pieces close to the length they need to be, setting them on the edge here, and then just coming in below and marking the bottom of that board with a pencil. And then we'll just cut right along that line and you'll see it'll fit in really nicely. We have our 10-foot board. We're gonna just cut it directly in the center on this one. And then we'll have 2 equal pieces with plenty of extra on each side, because these boards are gonna end up about 4 foot 3 inches. Remember, we have a 4 foot wide garden bed with an 1.5 inch overhang on each side. We're just gonna set these boards on the ends. We'll pay attention to whether there's any part of the board that we wanna lose on either side. There are no splits or anything on these. I like this side the best. I think this is the prettiest. Now, because the board is resting on top of the other bench, it's really easy to get underneath with a pencil. I just want to push directly down, make sure it doesn't move around, and get my mark underneath. A little bit over here that I couldn't reach. And do the same thing over here. Put a little mark on here. This side is facing north, just to remember which is which. Great, so this is where we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're not gonna just push this board into the guide and cut it, most likely. Let's take a look. We can put the blade up to our line and see how well it goes along the line. You see, it starts to get off the line just a little bit, and it is quite close, but you'll notice that slight difference when it comes to actually putting it into place. So all we need to do is just slide this board out just a little bit to get this blade along the line. There we go. So I just changed the angle of the board, and that's really nice and close. I'm just going to hold this into place. It's not up against the guard here. You can actually see that there's a little bit of a gap. There's a little bit of a gap on that side, but this side is all the way up against the guard because we've accounted for that slightly off of 45-degree angle. You can see that I've cut the one side off of each end of these boards. Now I have to actually change the angle of this saw because I've got my marks here already made from marking from underneath. So not a big deal. I like to try and set myself up to have to make adjustments to the saw as little as possible, and we can accomplish that here. I've got a roller stand here. You can use that to keep this side from falling, or if you have a friend handy, it works too. And we'll use the exact same method on this side. Success! Still have all my fingers, and we're ready to put these into place. So, fortunately I marked them, otherwise I think I would have surely lost track. This was the north side. And you can see how uniform that little space is, which is really good. And same thing over here. Nice and uniform, really slight gap. And I really like that uniformity here. Looks great. I love it. New battery time. Let me show you how we put in the rest of these screws. Now you can space these a little bit differently if you'd like to. This is just how I do it. We already have our screws in the corners. Got my handy 2¼ inch guide here. What I'm gonna do is just make a mark halfway in this bed. It's now, looking at the bench itself, halfway is 4 foot 1½ inches. I'm gonna put a screw in the center, and then from there, I'll split the difference moving outwards out to the corners where I put the rest of these screws. This same guide that I'm using to determine the depth where I'm gonna place the screw, I'm gonna use it also for the spacing for my other screws. And I find that I'm able to eyeball pretty well. You know, I've got it here with the screw I already have in place at the beginning of the block, and then that's 1 block space, 2 block spaces. And I'm gonna put another screw here. 1 block space, 2 block spaces. So the reason I do that is because I'm looking for some uniformity here and some symmetry. The space between these last 2 screws is a little bit larger than the distance between these, but it'll be the same way all the way around. And it's just a simple way to do it without having to really do math with your tape measure and marking and figuring out exactly where you're going to put each screw. You know, just use a simple guide like this, follow a system that allows you to really lay it out easily, and it'll look really great. It'll be uniform all the way around. I want to show you one more thing I like to do in the corners. You know, we only have these screws in along one line here, and I want to give this all a little bit more security by putting another screw that goes into this 4x4 corner post. So I do eyeball this part of it. You can use a method for, you know, getting them precisely the same, but I like to bring 1 screw in here and 1 screw in here. And I've done it enough times that I can get it looking pretty uniform. All right, 1 Great, good looking corner. And so to finish this off, we just have to go around and put in the rest of the screws, and this bench will be really nicely secure. And you can see this side is already done. It's a really nice, solid, sturdy bench. It's much more comfortable than just sitting on the edge. It's easy to place your tools or maybe some produce that you've just harvested. And overall, just a really nice touch. Your friends are gonna be impressed. I'm really happy with the way that this turned out. We have a nice solid bench on here now, and this garden bed is almost ready to go. We just need to sand it and stain it. That'll be another video. We'll give you lots of tips about that. Just doing those nice little finishing touches that will create something really beautiful that won't give you splinters and also last a long time. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to catch any of our other videos on building raised beds or also just general vegetable gardening, you can check out our website at thriveandgrowgardens.com, and we have linked in the description that previous video of building this one. So I hope that helps. Happy gardening, happy projects, and I hope you learned a lot. See you on the next one. Hello and welcome back to the Thrive and Grow Gardens workshop. My name is Michael, and today we are going to be sanding and staining those beautiful redwood raised garden beds that we built in those last couple of videos. Here they are. This is one and there's the other in the back. They've really turned out great. They just need that last touch of some smoothing and polishing, get them all ready for staining. There's a few tools that we're going to be needing today. One, an orbital sander is my preference. This gives you the ability to really go around and get the flat areas as well as the edges really easily. So I recommend this DeWalt orbital sander. It's a DWE 6423, and this has been working really well for us. We also have our sanding discs, and these are 80 grit sandpaper. And I like to go a little bit more aggressive with the grit on these so that it doesn't take forever to go through. The wood's pretty rough, and these do give a really nice smooth finish when they're all done. And of course, make sure that you're not breathing all of that sawdust in. So get yourself a good respirator mask or an N95 like this. Keep that dust out of your lungs. We're gonna take these garden beds outside to sand them. Otherwise, it just coats everything in the shop with dust. Even though this thing does capture a good amount of the dust that comes out, it's really just not enough. So we'll roll them outside, sand them out there. It's a beautiful day out, and then we'll bring them back in for the staining process. Here we go. We're out here and we are ready to get this thing sanded. So our goals here are going to be to take care of any little rough edges. We'll round these corners just a little bit, put a little bull nose on them. And we're also looking to remove any little imperfections. Marks like this, little scratches, and anything that is gonna show through the stain. And ultimately, I wanna be able to rub my hands all over this thing without getting any splinters. So stuff like this will all get sanded away. The boards come with some wax marks like this, some writing on them. We'll remove all of that as well. So let me just kind of give you a little demonstration of what we're looking for here. Also, the ends of these boards, we'll sand those down too. So you can see with this orbital sander how nice it is to be able to just really easily round the corners, and that's why we like this as a tool. And the corners take the most work usually, but this is what we're shooting for. You can rub your hand all over it without getting any splinters. It's nice and rounded, and once we go around the whole thing, you'll see just how fresh it is and how sharp it'll look. Just like any of your other projects around the house, it's always that preparation that's going to lead to the best end result. So now Aurora's going to take off on this and get it all sanded and get it ready to stain. Start by applying the stain to the garden bed with a roller. Fill in all the little spaces that you can and make sure you get really good coverage during this step. After you have applied this first coat with a roller, you're going to go back with a rag and do the final touches and make sure that you get out any swirls or streaks. The stain will need to soak into the wood before you do that final touch with a rag. In this case, Aurora covers half of the bed with a roller before going back and doing the finishing touches with a rag. But you might find that that's too much area to cover based on your environmental conditions and also your skill level.
We have just rolled on our first coat of stain, and we're going to want to allow a few minutes to let the stain soak into the wood. You don't want to wait too long, because if you let it dry too much it gets really difficult to work with, but if you do it too soon, all the stain comes out of the wood and onto your rag. So what we're going to do is we're going to work the stain into the wood. Just kind of round circular motions, and this is also a good opportunity to dip your rag and work it into these seams and corners that you can't get to with the brush. Once you have it nice and worked in order to get rid of these kind of swirling lines in the wood, I like to do one just long interrupted swipe. Try to have your hand, the weight in your hand as evenly distributed as possible. And this will get rid of most of the lines, and the lines that it doesn't get rid of will go along with the grain, so you can't notice them as easily. Once you have worked all of your stain in, you can go ahead and check your work by taking a flashlight or any light source, moving along the boards, making sure you haven't missed any spots, and also that there aren't any swirls in the stain. So all of this looks nice and even. I don't see any streaks or lines, no tufts of rag stuck in the stain. Yeah, looks good. I think we're done.
A day has now passed, and this beautiful stain that Aurora put on this garden bed is now dry, and this garden bed's ready to grow some food. We're gonna take it out to our client's house today, put it in. Really turned out absolutely beautiful. You did a fantastic job, Aurora. Yeah. So I hope that the tips that we gave you through this process are really gonna help you with your projects. And stay tuned for more. We'll have an upcoming video where we actually install these and get the soil and irrigation, so you can learn a lot from that process. And check out the last video too. If you want to build a garden bed like this, take advantage of that video on building raised garden beds. And I really believe that you can do this yourself. So check out those links in the description for all those tutorials, and check out the rest of our YouTube channel. Subscribe, like our videos. We really appreciate you. And we're just gonna keep on pumping out gardening videos to help you all succeed. Thanks for watching.